Russellville and Logan County has a ton of historical landmarks right here in South Central Kentucky. We wanted to create a series highlighting these with local historian Evelyn Richardson. Today we're at the Saddle Factory right here on East 4th Street. We hope you enjoy.
We do not know exactly when they came here. It could have been as early as the late 1700s, in the 1790s. But there was a person who brought his family here named Caldwell, and on the way from out east he died. And his two older sons, Andrew and David, had learned the tanning business from him and were coming here to probably do this very thing, set up a tannery and a saddle factory. And on the way he died and was buried before he got here, but those two older sons knew the trade well enough that they carried on and got the job done. We know they were here by 1808, and the saddle factory was built in 1817 as best we can figure out. So they were here at the turn of that century, we know, and established as residents of Russellville. The square in Russellville is where it has always been when the town was settled. They developed a middle of town, and there was a courthouse built eventually, not right away. And so everything tried to center itself as close to the square as they feasibly could. It's hard for us to go back that long ago and realize there were no cars, there were no paved streets, but we had wagon factories, we had gunpowder factories, and whatever the people needed. There was a nail factory at one place, blacksmith shops, all sorts of things that would supply the people's needs that lived in that time. Now, the saddle factory is 2 blocks on the corner of the 3rd block from the square, and they were fairly close for an industry. And there was a block next to the saddle factory that was the center of industry, although it was scattered throughout the town. It had a rope factory, and it had a brewery, and there were some cabinet makers who lived on that block. The jail was actually there on that block. But they also settled where they were because there was a Town Creek branch in that area, and they had a tannery behind the saddle factory where they processed their hides. And the water was, of course, a resource they had to have for the tanning process. So I guess that was probably the main reason why they set up shop exactly where they were. Well, they made saddles, of course. And they made saddles for the U.S. Army. So there was certainly a big market for what they were making there. But individuals could buy saddles there as well. And other leather products, they made pouches that you could carry things in. They made shoes. They made anything that was leather that was commonly used in that day. So besides that, they made some gunpowder. And they also sold tobacco because it's been a main crop for Logan County from its beginning. They took trips to New Orleans and sold their products there. They would go down to New Orleans with a load not only of the saddle factory products, but also of tobacco. And a tragedy happened when one of them was coming back from New Orleans, the younger brother, and he died of cholera on the way and was buried on the way here. It does have a basement and 2 floors and then an attic. The 2 main floors were where the saddles were made. One of the main features, the most interesting features of the factory, is the wide windows that it has in it. In old houses, you did well to have just a 2-foot window to get light through, but this one has numerous panes, and it was built wide so 2 men would have room to stand at that window and work during daylight. There was no electricity, of course, and candlelight wasn't nearly as good for making those stitches. Everything was done by hand. and they had to have the best light that they could find. So the windows were made very wide for the purpose of more people being able to work in that good daylight. And the basement had a natural limestone fireplace in it, and we have in writing that it made steam that kept the hides soft and pliable for use when they used them to make into products. On the 4th floor in the attic is where persons lived. Many of the people that worked there, when we don't know how many employees there were, we've seen varying numbers. And I've seen a 44 number of persons that worked in the factory. Might have been more, sometime might have been fewer. But anyway, they lived there and then worked during the daytime, so it was their lodging was on in the attic on the 4th floor. And indentured servants were many of their employees. And an indentured servant was someone who needed work, and they signed up to work there, usually for 7 years. They might have stayed for different time periods, but we have an inscription that one of those persons wrote on the wall or the ceiling on the 3rd floor, and of a date, and he says, 2 years from today, I will be free. And those persons might have been sent there by their parents on purpose to learn the trade, but then also orphans who didn't have anywhere else to go were taken in, and they worked there. And of course, they didn't get paid, but they had their room and board and learned a trade while they were there. A building did go up behind the saddle factory. They called it the L, E-L-L in architecture, where the families lived. It was a building with 4 large rooms, and to be on site and live there was important for them, I guess, to run the industry. The last member of the family, and she was a descendant, didn't have the Caldwell name, but through the marriages through different generations, Miss Fanny Bowden had a boarding school in the saddle factory building for young ladies, and that was the last member of the family who lived there. It was sold to, interestingly, another factory family that made hosiery, and the Kimball family that was here in my generation, and they lived there for a number of years. Though not kin to the Caldwells, they were industrialists, and perhaps that's why the saddle factory appealed to them to make their home. It lasted a long time. We don't know exactly when it closed, but if it started in the early 1800s and went even that century, that was a long period of time for it to be in operation. I can't imagine making a saddle by hand, what sort of needles you would have and the strength it would take to have to pull those needles through the hides. And so industrialization is what happened to it. Manufacturing became a mechanized business instead of something you did by hand. Russellville was the 3rd most important industrial city in the state of Kentucky back in these early years. That's hard for us to imagine with our big cities that we have now that are industrial centers, but it was. And if we don't have a concrete thing to look at sometimes, we don't get as much of the history imagined in our mind as when we have these things to show us how life was. We hope that it will be standing a century from now and be able to tell its own story as we have learned it so far.